This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
I'll try spinning, that's a good trick.
What's up, MetaNerds? This video will be an updated, complete breakdown in history of the N-1 Starfighter, looking under the armor and out to the different variants and uses over 60 plus years, from before the Clone Wars out to the Battle of Exegol. Let's start with its manufacturer, Theed Palace Space Vessel Engineering Corps, which was the in-house or in-palace shipwrights that made their own exclusive ships for the royal family and military.
I mean, these are all handmade, no droids.
That being said, they did not produce all of their parts, especially not the major components like engines and weapons. Instead, it was something like building your own PC, getting the top-of-the-line materials and assembling them on Naboo. Most of these components come from Nubia Star Drives, a company considered to be the highest level luxury brand in the galaxy, both in terms of their mechanical standards, but also praised for their unique and beautiful designs. Everyone across the galaxy knew their reputation.
Oh, not bad, huh? Nubian, huh?
The royal house would make use of the J-type craft like the 327 and Cruiser, which instantly impressed people with a complete chromium plating, a material that had greater blast resistance than your standard Durasteel, and it was easier to clean as well as being better at blocking out electrical interference, perfect for defensive countermeasures. And of course, it let people know that you were incredibly wealthy. And on Naboo, all other ships were banned from using this material, as it became synonymous with the royal ships. It's interesting to note that though C-3PO looks goldish, he and many other droids would have a light chromium finishing layer, likely for the block against electrical interference and resistance to carbon buildup, while Captain Phasma chose it for a combo of all of the traits mentioned, with her chromium being salvaged from a lost wreckage of a J-type ship that was personally owned by Emperor Palpatine. The N-1 would measure 11 meters or 36 feet long, or about a Wookiee shorter than an X-Wing, and about 2 meters longer than the droid's AAT. And everything we're about to see, including the chromium plating, totals up to a cost of 200,000 credits. As we go under the plating, start by noting that the fuel tank and sensor arrays were some of the few parts that were crafted entirely by the Theed engineers. It's unclear what type of fuel they used, and as advanced as it is, there's a possibility that it used hypermatter like a Utapawan P-39 Starfighter, but I find that really unlikely, especially with what we see later. More likely it was Tabana gas, which is able to be used in your energy weapons and ion weapons, and is in a majority of ships from fighter to destroyer, or it could have been Malastair fuel or rhodium. Again, likely Tabana, like that produced on Cloud City, and it would get pumped in via the tail that gets docked into a coupling unit that lined the palace hangars. And the electrical systems and data cables were also connected here as well. These units lining each dock likely represent fuel and energy levels, and the electricity goes through the power charge collector, and ship info and updates go through the electromag signal receiver, charging the power node, and then the power cells which energize the bolts for the twin laser cannons, as well as the mechanism that fires the proton torpedoes, which had 2 magazines which each carried 5 torpedoes, or 10 in total that would fire through this single tube. The fuel pumps and hydraulics are also packed into the central area, with multiple fuel lines going out to the nacelles, energized in the ionization chamber. Most Star Wars ships use ion propulsion, a real technology but which is nowhere near as effective yet, and like the twin ion engine fighter of the Empire, almost all ships move forward by energizing a gas and shooting the resulting ions out of the back. This is what causes the blue glow, and the combustion chamber on the N-1 is one of those highly customized pieces by the Theed engineers, made to withstand higher temperatures, and they combined it with the ship's iconic finials. Besides the graceful and elegant appearance, they were a stunning piece of engineering that worked to draw the heat off in a way that was said to be more efficient than any other ship, out of a combo of rapidly circulating coolant and just the shape. The need for this was also in part out of an environmental concern, as Naboo had been trying to reduce emissions on their world for centuries, seeing what many other worlds in the mid and outer rim did to devastate their atmospheres, either through war or industry. And that is why the Naboo people are noted for having both this ancient-looking architecture and being environmentalists and pacifists, seeing the negative effects of the warmongering and high industrialization of their neighbors. This efficient engine was a J-type Nubian 221, while the hyperdrive was a Nubian Monarch C4. The sublight engines hit a top atmospheric speed of 1,100 km per hour, or 684 miles per hour, making it faster than the X-Wing but slower than a TIE. though I'll talk about how it was modified later to be perhaps the fastest ship in the galaxy, but even this model had an impressive Class 1 hyperdrive with a 1,000 light-year range. Larger fighters like X-Wings and ARC-170s have hyperdrives built in, but many smaller craft like droid fighters or Jedi starships did not have them, and like we saw with the Jedi, they had to use these hyperspace rings instead. The N-1 was only limited by the size of its fuel tank, and a way to extend this was to have the diplomatic barge acting like a refueling dock, where the tails could attach just like on Naboo. These engines also have an array of sensors to detect any issues, and towards the front of the nacelle we see the pressure manifold and cluster of rangefinder, targeting systems, and flight sensors, while the comm antennas and receivers line the front ridge. There were no credits spared creating the N-1, so the life support systems and shielding are the most reliable you could buy, and then further modified to be optimized with this chassis. While the laser cannons were also shielded and had their own stabilizing field that made it nearly impossible for this weapon to malfunction, neither misfiring or rupturing the barrel. We don't really ever see that happen with other ships, but even if it was a very rare event, like a bad primer in a bullet, the Naboo Royal Engineers made sure their weapon systems had the equivalent of the best trigger, bolt, bullets, and barrel all built in. And then there was the astromech integration. It was not the first to use this system, but definitely one of the most successful, with the R2 unit placed right behind the cockpit, allowing it to operate all the ship's systems, communicate with other R2 units in the fleet, while also carrying out repairs. Naboo loved its astromechs, and used them to repair everything from the larger J-type yachts, where they could magnetize and scoot around on the exterior to repair things even in the middle of combat, while in the N-1 it sat right above the data, electrical, and fuel lines, being able to physically manipulate them if need be, though it did most of its work being plugged directly in and optimizing things on the software side. And turning to the cockpit, we see the repulsor lifts that get this thing off the ground were activated with the push of this large button. The pilot has a comfy little headrest pillow, and the ship enters flight mode with the pull of this lever, closing the cockpit's transparasteel bubble, while the control yoke has a central red button that fires the laser cannons. These three screens display everything from the status of the shields, weapons, torpedo count, fuel, navigation, and threat detection, and if we look close we can see it provides a detailed picture of a specific target, with these little droidicas popping up. While the center screen shows the location that the autopilot was guiding you towards, and once you are in space you get a targeting system that shows the path of enemy fighters, with that left screen changing between icons displaying statuses but also text from the R2 unit. Also keep in mind these astromechs have much more computing power when plugged into a ship. As you can see, this entire area behind the unit is a computer designed to be integrated with the R2. And just a couple other things to point out before we move on to the variants in history, is the acceleration compensator right behind the cockpit, and the landing gear was located over here. All those touches, from the chromium to the pointed nacelles, handcrafted parts, and fail-proof weapons, may not seem like that big of a deal from the outside. There are tons of cheaper and simpler ships that can do the same thing, but it's the difference between a Camry and a Koenigsegg. One works really well, and better if you measure in terms of mass production or ease of repair, but the features that one might see as a lot of overkill was exactly what was loved by mechanics and pilots all across the galaxy, who could appreciate this engineering marvel and had use of the specialized applications. And speaking of mechanics, we need to look underneath the hangar to see the repair bay in the Theed Palace. Like the Venator, parts of the flight deck could retract to allow the craft to be maintenance down below, while above we see the racks that could stack the N1s up to 3 high, and on both sides totaling around 50, each with the same recharging/refueling banks in the tail plug. The Naboo ancestral architecture style covered everything in brick, but this was a high-tech material as well, being highly blast resistant, and behind the facade was everything you'd find in a Coruscant spaceport, with the central guiding system using tractor beams to gently float the ships in automatically, working in sync with the beacons and enormous comm towers up in the dome. Couple cool things to note here is the ancient Naboo goddess standing outside for good luck, and a detail that the veteran pilots claim that they don't need any of these guidance systems. They can come racing in safely by simply using the waterfall to gauge the winds. As for its history, the first version was actually the N-1L light starfighter, which lacked the main finial, and was both less powerful and more difficult to refuel and charge. The N-1 would be developed further into the N-1T Advanced, with a wider body to house a more powerful laser cannon, and the finial is raised up and off of the main body, perhaps for additional power or a stronger shield projector. There were also 3 levels of the bomber variant, the NB-1, 1S, and 1T, which mostly differed in their payload capacity. The G1 was painted green and cost half the price, scrapping the Class 1 hyperdrive and optimizing for longer travel times. Meant to patrol the Naboo solar system, doing long-range patrols that could stay away from a fuel source for up to 2 weeks. And then there was the NX police cruiser, painted blue, and worked with engines and hyperdrives that were about half as powerful as the N-1. These units were most often seen by your average citizen, being used by the Naboo Royal Security Forces, while the N-1 stayed in the palace and only came out for important ceremonial parades, like a coronation ceremony. But funny enough, this N-1 had only been developed a year before the blockade, in the year 33 BBY, with King Ars Varuna ordering their development, something that was at the time considered just a pet project, but it quickly gained the respect of their pilots, and would prove to be his most lasting and valuable contribution to Naboo. It was during this blockade when Anakin and this ship became unlikely heroes. It should be noted that R2 likely piloted Anakin directly into the thick of battle, only to give him controls right over the Lucrehulk, as R2 had to be in control of everything the entire time. By using the proton torpedoes to destroy the Trade Federation warship, this little N-1 entered a mythical status, as details became fuzzier as the tale was repeated, but everyone knew that this unique Naboo ship was a high-end luxury model, with stories exaggerating it as a battleship killer. Which is technically true, but of course even a barrage from its torpedoes could not come close to breaking through the shields of warships of this size. Despite that, the tales made mercenary groups salivate at the prospect of owning one, always being a bit of a status symbol as well, and there were multiple attempts to acquire them, some hoping to bribe members of the government, or pay off some pilot to become a traitor, and mercs from Agamar convinced a Naboo expat named Dren Meln to return home and join the Royal Security Forces, where he also became a lover to his commanding officer, all out of a deep undercover plot to secure a squadron of these fighters. He provided the intel that the Agamarians used to set up an ambush, and he thought he had something in place to disable the ships, but when the plot failed and the N-1 squad escaped, the mercs made sure to kill Dren Meln to cover up their involvement. By the Clone Wars era, this ship's features had some unintentional but very useful advantages. Part of why they wanted the ship to directly plug in was to keep royal movements a secret, avoiding intercepting data via wireless transmission, so the only source of downloading was right in the security room or when docked on other Naboo ships, which became especially important during the Trade Federation invasion and the subsequent battle with hordes of droid units during the Clone Wars. And that chromium protection from interference was nice too. They would remain in service on Naboo up through the fall of the Empire, being seen in the celebration following news of the Emperor's death. 9 years after the Battle of Endor, we see that Pelimoto had come into possession of one, housing it in Hangar 3-5 on Mos Eisley. We can speculate endlessly on how this happened, and Padme did have a personal N-1, but it was all chrome, no yellow paint. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Force would have it where this was the exact ship used by Anakin, it coming back to his homeworld and being used in the canyons of the Boonta Eve Classic pod race course, all may be nods to this connection. As we can see, it's in heavy need of repairs, but that's actually a good thing at this point, as much like luxury vehicles from our world, there were a lot of things that could be improved on 40 years later.
I mean, these are all handmade. No droids. Because this baby's pre-Empire, she's off the grid. And did I mention she can jump into hyperspace with no docking ring?
That being off the grid part was a part of the Emperor's initiative to track the movement of everyone and everything in the galaxy, those chain codes that we saw introduced in Bad Batch.
It's not just ships. They're registering people too.
She understands this is one of the greatest finds in the entire galaxy, and a gearhead's dream to make a souped up one. We see that they go with more speed, but keep this still remarkable hyperdrive system intact, even if you are forced to use old hyperware, the software for hyperspace.
Okay, I'm looking for mostly bolt-on aftermarket speed mods. This is all hand-built custom. I'm guessing we need vintage hyperware if it's gonna fit this antique.
She seems to hint at it at least doubling the top speed, and the result certainly looks like it, and we really get to see her expertise working with such a specialized craft, as Mando had to understand the latest innovations.
Trust me, the last thing you want strangling your thrust capacitor is a vapor manifold. I fabricated you this induction intake charger that's going to double your output coefficient.
We see that in lieu of the palace connections, they were able to convert the charging finial tail to work off a gonk droid, while the fuel would be pumped in above the new third engine added right under the cockpit, likely taking up this entire section meant for the astromech and its augmented computer. Remember, the fuel lines and energizers for the laser cannons were in this region, where we now see this raised device that works to power this triple supercharged engine system. as well as the beefier cannons, which are now raised up and appear to be at least medium if not high power. All of this required additional cooling.
Where did they get a cryogenic density combustion booster?
All that state-of-the-art work on the thinning finial nacelles had to be augmented by these cryogenic attachments. This bare-bones approach made it lighter, but also helped to keep everything cooler. And of course, the R5 astromech unit thought they were all idiots for thinking they could operate this thing without its help, as both navigator and repairman.
You know, I figured with your disposition, you'd want to forego the astromech. Hey! Watch your language around the customers.
And the droid has a point. This normally would be a big problem, but it must be solved by the advances in computing, likely working to include something that just calculated the hyperroute, but none of the additional advantages that a full astromech unit provided. When he takes it for a spin, we still see the same blue glow from the ion engines, and everything in the cockpit seems to work the same, though they did have to add this extra screen to monitor these extra systems, perhaps being solely dedicated to the state of the engines and their heat. As he zips through the canyon and then out of atmosphere, it's obvious that this thing is far faster than your fastest stock ships like the A-Wing or Eta II. It's interesting to imagine how this will be used by Mando as he joins forces with Boba Fett, with Fett manning the heavy firepower but larger and slower Slave 1, and Din Djarin zipping around at speeds that nobody would expect. The proton torpedo tube is still in place, but it's unclear if he actually has torpedoes, if there is even room left after all these additions, or how he would find them in a junkyard. Though of course, we shouldn't put this past the Jawas. The ship is a big departure from the Razor Crest, a mobile home and gunship like Slave 1, but all Mando has to do is something like Anakin did with the Twilight. It shouldn't be hard to find more spice freighters in this neck of the woods, and that ship did have heavy shields and heavy firepower, while having its own quarters for a crew, and even a hangar for smaller ships like the Jedi Starfighter. A small Mandalorian clan could call this home, and have the power to raid much larger vessels, while hiding the fastest ship in the galaxy, letting it rip out of the back unexpected and acting as an interceptor. There's definitely some amazing potential here. And this isn't the latest existing N-1 we see. In 34 ABY, Iden Versio would face off against Janata Security, a private military force that aided the First Order in conquering helpless worlds and kidnapping children to turn them into soldiers. This ship that once embodied the ideals of beauty and peace was now a part of something that struck terror into worlds across the Outer Rim and unknown regions. As JSEC was masterful at modifying and maintaining older vessels, everything from the Nebulon B and GR-75 transports to V-Wings and even N-1 Starfighters. They had multiple units of this vessel that was considered rare even when it was being produced new on Naboo. And one of these N-1s, owned by the commander of this kidnapping project, Security Officer Lee Mackay, heavily modified his N-1 to take advantage of newer parts that were both smaller and more efficient, leaving him room to install seismic charges. It's unclear how many of these it could carry, but despite using the expert tactic of unleashing these in an asteroid field, Iden Versio still managed to lock on and blow this antique out of existence. The last time we see an N-1 was during the Battle of Exegol in 35 ABY, where several of them joined the thousands of ships from across the galaxy that sought to finally put an end to the Emperor. At least in the end, the Naboo people could be proud that their iconic ship played a part in restoring peace to the galaxy, and likely acted as a nice morale booster for anyone who saw that flash of chromium as it raced by. So that's it for the breakdown in history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. In Legends, the chromium was purely for decoration, a nod to a time when their ships did need heavy plating to repel the dangerous electromagnetic rays, as those first primitive starships finally broke out into space. But now shield generators easily protected ships from this. But the royal family wanted to use the chromium plating as a sort of call to their ancient rule, and though this has changed in canon to have a more practical purpose, it's nice that that line about there being so many hand-finished parts actually comes from the old cross-section. I thought it was neat that in this shot you see 3 eras of ships, the X-Wing in red, a New Republic blue variant, and the prequel N-1. The full-size prop from Episode 1 was displayed in Boston's Museum of Science in 2005, and would actually hang suspended by wires for several years. There was much hoopla around the question, how can R2 fit into this thing? If the tube is snug around his head, how do his feet fit? Doug Chiang, who designed this and many other amazing designs, and who is still working with Star Wars projects including the Book of Boba Fett, said Lucas personally altered the design to cause this problem, all in making it look more sleek, and he loved that it had the chrome look of 50s cars. And so the Episode 1 Incredible Cross-Section book hoped to address this problem by saying that R2 is brought up from the bottom and that his head telescopes up into place. And though not official, they were a cool unlock in the Rogue Squadron games, and would appear in tons of other games as well, all the way up through the new Battlefront 2. Details from this video come from the Cross-Sections books, Essential Guide to Warfare, and even the novel Darth Plagueis, which has a heavy focus on Naboo. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to check out the link down below for 10% off Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated, members-only content, manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights, all on one easy-to-use platform. Community is key to building your website, and their fully integrated commenting system supports threaded comments, replies, and likes. There are also third-party extensions that are great for e-commerce, like streamlined bookkeeping, product promotion, and inventory management, and can automatically push content from your social media channels. The best way to make your website the all-in-one hub you've dreamed of. So use the link in the description to go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, head over to squarespace.com/MetaNerdz to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. In the description, you can also find links to our Patreon and PayPal. And special thanks to our supporters over on Patreon, especially our $25 tier supporters, Bill Payne, Brandon Robinson, and Oscar Jones. But most important of all, remember, you can build anything with enough credits and faith in your Jawas. And the Force will be with you, always.